Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to get started just introducing the webinar as people start to trickle in, and then hopefully everyone will be in by the time our speaker starts. So welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is the webinar series Topics at the Nexus of Climate Change, Fisheries, and Blue Foods. So this webinar series is jointly hosted by a few UN Ocean Decade programs, Blue Food Futures, FishSCORE, which is Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems, SUPREME, which stands for Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems, and then SmartNet, which stands for Sustainability of Marine Ecosystems through Global Knowledge Networks. And then we have FishMIP as well, the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project. And then also one of our endorsed projects, Basin Scale Events to Coastal Impacts, or BECI. So there will be a link posted in the chat where you can find out more about the programs that host this webinar series. So this month we are focusing on the topic of integrating climate change into fisheries management. And Natalie Couchman here is going to share their risk-based approach out of Australia. So I'm going to welcome the presenter, Natalie. Natalie Couchman is from the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, and she's a fisheries manager with more than 15 years of experience in fisheries regulation, policy development, and program implementation. She has worked across a wide range of Commonwealth fisheries, applying her regulatory expertise to complex management challenges. So most recently, she's focused on delivering strategies that enable adaptive fisheries management in a changing climate. So thank you very much and welcome to Natalie. And I think I will pass it over to you.
Lovely. Thanks for that intro, Grace. Thanks everybody for attending today. I'll just do a quick intro in terms of what my agency is and what we do. So I work for the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, and we're a federal government agency in Australia who's responsible for the sustainable management of our offshore commercial fisheries. We share responsibility for fisheries in Australian waters with our state and territory governments as well. And those governments generally manage inshore fisheries out to 3 nautical miles. So it's a bit of a complex governance arrangements in terms of our fisheries management, and it creates some challenges that we have to deal with day to day. So I'll kick off. If you can do the first slide, please, Claire. So I'll kick off with a quick summary of how climate change is impacting the oceans surrounding Australia before I run through how we're responding with regards to our commercial fishing sector, and in particular the climate risk framework that we've developed. So Australia has recently finalised a national climate risk assessment in late 2025. And in terms of our marine ecosystems surrounding Australia, they were assessed to be at high risk from climate change. And to demonstrate some of the changes that we are seeing, sea surface temperature, which is some of the graphs you see on the left of the slide, is just one of the many indicators that we use to monitor our changing climate around Australia. And these figures are showing a general trend of warming sea surface temperatures over the last 50 to 120 years. The top figure shows the anomaly in annual sea surface temperatures since the 1900s, and the bottom figure shows the trending global sea surface temperatures in terms of warming per decade since the 1970s. That little blue location marker is where I'm presenting from today on the east coast of Australia. You can see not far below that there's actually some a marine hotspot, which is creating some specific challenges for our fisheries down in the southeast corner there. In terms of the average sea surface temperature in the Australian region, it's warmed by more than 1 degree since the 1900s, and 9 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2010. So quite significant. Next slide, please. Apart from sea surface temperatures, Australian waters are also getting more acidic. Sea levels are rising. Major ocean currents around Australia are changing. and extreme weather events such as marine heat waves are becoming more severe. This flows through to our fish stocks. It's resulting in changes to our fish biomass, their distribution, and also their life histories in terms of how fast they're growing, their reproductive timing, and also their migration patterns. The critical habitats that these stocks rely on also continue to be impacted. And some of those that are more vulnerable include our mangrove, seagrasses, coral reefs, and other shelf habitats in particular. Next slide, please. In terms of the expected impacts on AFMA's stocks that we manage, climate sensitivity analyses and some ecosystem modelling studies undertaken by Australia's National Science Agency, which you'll be all familiar with, the CSIRO, they're predicting that commercial fisheries managed by us will be impacted by climate change over the coming 15 years. Southeast waters in particular are a hotspot for climate-driven ecosystem changes, and a number of our stocks are already being impacted in fisheries in this region. And modelling predicts that some stocks may decline by up to 20%. In our subantarctic regions, they're also likely to decline, while our northern prawn stocks may experience some decreases and greater variability across most of the target species. In terms of our small pelagics, as well as squid, they're not predicted to decrease in the short term, but we're expecting greater variability in terms of the biomass going forward, which will make it challenging to manage those stocks. So with all this on the horizon, AFMA's climate adaptation program was established a number of years ago to integrate the information we have on climate impacts into our fisheries management frameworks and to develop practical adaptation measures. And this is important because climate change can undermine our management decisions and the effectiveness of our management and compromise our ability to meet our legislative objectives. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're doing, we're building on our understanding of climate impacts across our Australian region, fisheries, and also at the species level. And we're doing this by working with both local and international experts to establish processes that predict, mitigate, and adapt to climate change. Collaboration, we found, is really key. It's a global challenge and we need shared solutions. And that's part of why we're presenting what we are today. Hopefully other jurisdictions will be able to take a look at what we're doing and see if it's useful in their own local contexts. The focus of today will be on our climate risk framework, which we've recently finalised, but there are a few other elements of our program which I'll touch on very briefly before I move on. So one other key component of our program are climate and ecosystem status reports, these are annual reports that go through to a range of our fisheries advisory committees every year, and they provide hindcast and forecast analysis on a range of ecosystem and environmental drivers that affect our fisheries. The intent of those reports are to help build an understanding of the environmental variables that may influence each fishery, and they provide a broader environmental context for decisions and recommendations that those groups are making around our stock assessments and TAC recommendations and things like that. They're currently in their 4th iteration and they're on our website if people are interested in taking a look. They've borrowed a little bit in terms of NOAA has much more extensive ecosystem reporting, but there are some similarities between what NOAA has been doing and what we've started to develop here in Australia. We've also got a range of fisheries summaries and fact sheets that provide snapshots about what we know about climate impacts on our fisheries as an educational tool for our stakeholders. There's also an adaptation handbook that's been developed in partnership with the CSIRO, which steps industry managers and other stakeholders through a structured process to rate climate change risks from fisheries and then discuss what adaptation options might be on the table. And we also, although we're not researchers ourselves, we do support a range of research to improve our understanding over time and have invested significantly over the last decade in understanding what climate change is going to bring for us. So next slide, thanks. So I'll go into the climate risk framework. What is it? It's a risk assessment process we have developed to integrate what we know about climate impacts on our fisheries into our existing management frameworks and to respond to those. So what we had before we had this framework was we had a whole lot of climate information, but we didn't know how to actually feed it through our management processes and up to our decision makers. And this is what this framework does. So when we apply this framework, we found that some fisheries will already have sufficient measures in place to effectively monitor and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Those are fisheries, for example, with data-rich climate-aware assessments, robust monitoring, MSC-tested harvest strategies. And what the framework does for these fisheries is, in effect, an audit of where they currently stand and maybe identify some small gaps on future work ahead. But for fisheries that might not have such measures in place, those that are data poor, have limited monitoring, untested harvest strategies, for example, for these fisheries, we found the application of the framework will act as a catalyst for action to bring those fisheries up to speed in terms of making sure they're adaptive and responsive to the changes ahead. Next slide. Thanks. So in terms of the process of development, I'll touch on this very briefly. The framework has been under development since 2023, with a trial being conducted throughout 24 and 25. And during that, it went through a couple of iterations and some key improvements were made. It was signed off by the AFMA Commission. They're our decision makers for our AFMA fisheries in September 2025, and it's now being implemented across AFMA fisheries and will be rolled out over the coming 3 years. And I'll present an early case study from that rollout in a moment. So during the development and trial phases, stakeholder engagement was extensive, but also critically important to get the product that we have today. We held multiple workshops, 7 meetings of an expert working group, which I'll introduce to you next. 4 of our AFMA Commission meetings considered progress along the way, and more than 30 fishery level advisory committee meetings provided input into the development process. So it was extensive and it's been robustly tested, and I'll go through who is in. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is our expert working group. So they've supported the development and trial of the framework, and now they're supporting the implementation as we roll it out. It's comprised of 4 world-leading experts in ecosystem-based fisheries science, fisheries modelling, and climate change and adaptation. And some of these faces will probably be familiar to you, Dr. Keith Sainsbury and Dr. David Smith, as well as 2 colleagues from our CSIRO, Dr. Beth Fulton and Dr. Alastair Hobday. So they've been pretty pivotal in the development as we go. Next slide, thanks. So in total, when we did trial the framework, it covered 15 commercial species across 6 AFMA fisheries. We selected the fisheries and species specifically to test the applicability and robustness of the framework when we applied it in different fisheries with different characteristics. So they were selected across different regions, from our sub-Antarctic down there in the south to our tropical fisheries up in the north. Species groups with different life history characteristics, from teleos through to invertebrates, and from data-rich to data-poor fisheries as well, to test how well it performed with different data inputs. Next slide. Thanks. So to give you a kind of a geographic feel for the scale of our fisheries, this is just an overlay of the continental USA, slightly bigger than Australia, but kind of gives you a feel for the breadth of our fisheries that we're managing. Next slide, thanks. So I'll go through each of the steps of the framework, and then I'll run you through a case study for one of the species that has been part of our early implementation, and that is the jackass morwong, somewhat unfortunately named, but a species of high interest to us because of its sensitivity to climate impacts. So step one involves looking at the best available information you have concerning climate impacts on a species, as well as the species stock status. And what you do is, from this matrix, is you take the risk score from each side and combine these to provide an overall risk score. Next slide, please. So there's a range of guidance that sets out how we respond and rank the information that we have. So on the climate impact side of the matrix, you assess climate risk using the best available climate information. And for AFMA fisheries, there's a range of information we draw on, from some sophisticated simulation studies through to some preliminary climate projections, and also some more data poor climate sensitivity analyses. There's also the case where we have individual fisheries, which will often have more refined analysis of environmental and ecosystem drivers for their key target species. And this is weighed up with the other information that we have available. So this table, which is a part of the key part of the framework, describes the risk thresholds depending on the type of information you have available. And it indicates in terms, and what it indicates in terms of the climate impacts on a species. This is something that can be tailored by other jurisdictions to reflect information available to them as well. Next slide, please. So this is the guidance in the framework around how we rank.
Natalie, are you there? I think we might have lost you.
Work accommodates all levels of assessments, and these can range from robust quantitative assessments of fishing mortality and biomass through to index-based assessments, through to more data poor or weight of evidence methods. Next slide, please. And just to come back to one of the key requirements at this step, and I'll revisit this later on, is the need to consider uncertainty. So there is inevitably going to be uncertainty in the climate information we have, as well as uncertainty in what a species stock status is as well. And this all needs to be weighed up in determining the risk to a species. There is some guidance in the framework and work examples on how to do so. So using the scores for each side of the matrix, you combine them. Top left is kind of where you don't want your species to be. That's in the higher risk, and bottom right is. And one of the things about the framework is it recognises that not all climate risks may actually be negative. We do expect there to be some winners from the changes that we're seeing, and the framework is designed to identify these. So next slide, thanks. Once you have a step one risk score, you then go ahead to identify current science, management, or industry measures that offer a response to climate impacts. In other words, measures that reduce the climate impact risk or the stock status risk. So there's not always a clear delineation between our science, management, and industry measures. They're often intrinsically linked. The important thing at this step is to document the measures that we do have in place. There's some guidance in the framework again around what measures may include in the science side of things. It could be time varying or recent estimates of life history and productivity parameters being included in your stock assessments, linking parameters in your stock assessments to environmental variables, or MSE testing that includes climate change scenarios, for example. In your management sphere, it could include things like spatial or temporal closures, flexible season dates, or gear modifications. And industry measures, these are voluntary measures. These aren't regulated measures. And they can include things such as regional catch limits, gear modifications, changes to fishing effort, or cooperation on data collection. Next slide, thanks. Once the measures in step two have been documented, these measures are then evaluated at step three to determine the residual risk remaining to the species. So through the development and trial process, this step of the process is one that has changed significantly and benefited greatly from the feedback that we received And it's now in the framework a more quantitative approach that requires data and information to support an adjustment of a risk score at step 3. So residual risk refers to the level of climate-related risk that remains after the step 2 measures have been implemented. And like I mentioned, it needs to be evaluated based on data or information, evidence in effect, to support a change in the risk rating. The residual risk should reflect the potential future state of the stock, assuming the treatment, in other words, the measures, have been effective. And where there are measures that have been proposed but not yet implemented, the risk hasn't been treated, so the residual risk score shouldn't take these into account, but they can be noted in the assessment. It's also important that if you do have information that helps you determine climate or stock status risks at step 1, do it at that step and don't wait to adjust your step 3 risk score based on an extra layer of information. Next slide, thanks. And this is some of the guidance that we have in the framework about the different levels of residual risk, what that might mean for our stocks, and then what are the expected next steps. Next slide, thanks. Step 4 really is where we wrap it up with providing advice to decision makers. And in this case, it's our AFMA Commission, but again, it can be to whatever decision maker there is for a fishery. So for species assessed as low risk at step 1, the advice can be simple and just conclude that no additional measures are required at this time. Might include ongoing monitoring of changes that are happening to make sure we're picking up signals early. But for species with higher risk scores, the advice to decision makers will need to be more detailed and include a plan of action. And in providing advice, it needs to be clearly articulated the reasons for that. So it's quite clear the justification for the next step forward. Next slide, please. So I'll take you through a case study from our early implementation of the final framework now. This is Jackass Morwong. It's one of our higher risk stocks where there's a growing body of evidence that the stock is significantly impacted by climate change. It's distributed around the southern half of Australia and as well as across to New Zealand and the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean as well. It occurs to depths of up to about 450 metres, and in Australian waters it's most abundant between about 100 and 200 metres, where it's primarily caught by our commercial fishers using trawl gear. There is some small amounts of longline catch as well. So looking at this species, when we look at climate impact, the highest tier of information we had available for this stock was some counterfactual simulation modelling that has been undertaken by the CSIRO. This falls into the top tier of information in the table 1 that I showed you earlier. The modelling used counterfactual scenarios to attempt to distinguish the relative influence of climate change and fishing pressure on stocks across our southeastern Australian region, that sensitive marine hotspot for us. The model was run under observed oceanographic conditions and then a counterfactual where climate change has not occurred. And a supplement was then to repeat these same runs with and without climate change, but in the absence of fishing, to try to further elucidate relative contributions of climate and fishing to observe changes in our stocks over a period of time. And this modelling indicated that climate change is a primary driver of stock depletion for this stock, and under our framework, this equates to a high climate risk. The assessment that we undertook also noted that there is an extended offshore post-larval period for Jackass Morwong. And the hypothesis at the moment is that this makes them more vulnerable to the shifting patterns of the currents down our east coast, to the East Australian current in particular, that are changing due to climate change. And it's believed this alteration in current flow is contributing to poor recruitment and a decline in stock abundance for this stock and others as well. So in terms of the stock status, what we relied on was the stock assessment that it was last assessed in 2021. We call this a Tier 1 stock assessment, so again, a top tier of information. It was based on a robust integrated quantitative stock assessment, and this estimated the biomass in 2022 to be 15% of virgin biomass. So what does that mean? We have target reference points and limit reference points that we manage our fisheries to. The limit reference point that we don't want stocks to drop below is 20% of virgin biomass, or B0, and the target is generally around 48%. So this one is well below the limit that we want it to be. We don't want it to fall below, and on that basis, it was assessed as depleted um, under the framework. You combine those. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. You combine those. Oh, sorry, I'm catching up. You combine those two scores, and what it comes out is at extreme risk. So we'll move on to step 2. Step 2, we documented the science, management, and industry measures. I'll touch on these briefly. The stock assessment, which I just touched on, some more detail on that. It adopted a low recruitment scenario for this stock, for both the biomass estimation as well as some projections that were made using the modelling, and that was based on 12 years of below average recruitment in the preceding period. The projections from that stock assessment showed that recovery to 40% of virgin biomass, which is still below our target, was only possible with zero catch, and that catches of between 50 and 100 tonnes would lead to slower recovery, reaching only 32% of virgin biomass under the 50-tonne scenario, or just above our limit, 21% of virgin biomass by around 2050 if you allowed some fishing. So on the basis of that stock assessment and those projections, AFMA advisory committees at the time recommended restricting total mortality to about 250 tonnes to align with policy requirements on rebuilding timelines. It was also identified at that time, as part of the assessment, that there are further projects underway to update some of the biological parameters being used for jackass morwong, including how we estimate age and size at maturity that is used in our stock assessments. So it's the case in a lot of our fisheries that the biological parameters that we're using are getting older and older as the years pass. They're based on old historical studies. But with the changes that climate change is driving in the physiology and phenology of stocks, there's a real need to get updated data and studies on our stocks to make sure our stock assessments are as accurate as possible. Next slide, please. So in terms of the 50-tonne limit on jackass morwong, look, we recognise that this species is actually caught in close association with a key target species in the fishery, and that's tiger flathead, which is the picture of the fish that you can see on the right there. And so because they're companion species, restricting just jackass morwong to 50 tonnes wasn't actually going to be as effective as we wanted it to be. We had some Metier analysis and fleet level analysis, which estimated that the unavoidable bycatch of jackass morwong caught alongside other species in the fishery would be approximately 100 to 120 tonnes, which exceeded the recovery thresholds predicted in the stock assessment. So as a result, AFMA not only implemented a lower TAC for jackass morwong, but we also moved to constrain the TAC for the main companion species, tiger flathead, recognising that if we didn't do so, the effectiveness of those catch controls would be undermined. Next slide, please. There were also 5 new cloches introduced down the east coast of Australia in the last, all these measures, management measures, are in the last 3 years. So 5 new closures were implemented down the east coast for the trawl sector to constrain catches as well. And these are indicated by the red arrows that you can see on the screen. And as you can see, looking at all the green and orange areas, that's all the closures for our trawl sector. And they're already significant in this fishery before we undertook further closures in response to the situation we had with jackass Morwong. So these new closures have actually reduced the available footprint for the fishery by between 15 and 20%. So quite a significant reduction for our fleet. Next slide, please. There were also measures recognising we need to just minimise the mortality of total mortality of jackass Morwong. Gear changes were implemented also for our Danish seine sector to promote escapement of juvenile fish. So they increase the minimum mesh size in the cod ends. Next slide, please. And in parallel with all these measures, recognising that they were going to have quite a significant impact on our industry, a structural adjustment process, aka it was a government buyout of our fishing rights, was undertaken to reduce the number of trawl fishing rights. And they were reduced from 57 to 36, so quite a significant reduction. In terms of the cumulative effect of these measures on the catch and effort for jackass Morwong, trawl effort declined in the last couple of years by 23% in terms of shots, 11% fewer hours, and landed catch has declined from 88 tonnes before the measures were introduced to 58 tonnes in the most recent year. However, it was noted at the time that catch by the state commercial fishers, so those are the inshore fishers which AFMA doesn't manage but which our state government does, had increased significantly. And there was concerns that these increasing catches by the inshore fishers were offsetting some of the gains made under the AFMA measures that were being introduced. There was also a couple of plan measures that were noted in the assessment, but as they weren't quite implemented yet, they were just noted. We're rolling out electronic monitoring. That's cameras on boats. We already have electronic reporting, but this is putting cameras on boats, and that's coming in mid this year. And we'll give fishery managers a better handle on discards, in particular for this stock and other stocks of interest. There's also work underway to develop a multi-species harvest strategy approach for the main fishery in the southeast corner that catches jackass Morwong. And it's looking to replace quite a dated single species harvest strategy approach that we currently apply to the main fishery down in the southeast corner. And part of this, importantly, will include MSE testing of that new strategy under different climate scenarios to see how well it should perform into the future. Next slide, thanks. In terms of our industry voluntary measures, the industry is quite involved in what is called the Fisheries Ships of Opportunity program. I understand there's an international push across quite a few countries, and this is where there are sensors that are placed on fishing gear or boats that measure temperature and depth data when gear is deployed. And so the intent of that is it's collecting finer scale oceanographic data that will support future modelling and assessment for our fish stocks. So quite a excellent initiative that's underway. Under co-management, industry will also be running a program to collect biological samples from the 5 new closures to support future assessments and also evaluate how effective those closures are going to be in terms of managing impacts on jackass Morwong and other vulnerable stocks. So next slide, please. So quite a lot has been done for jackass Morwong over the last few years in recognition of the observed decline and also understanding the drivers of that decline as well. So when we get to step 3, which is where we look at what is the impact of all those measures and does that is that expected to reduce either the climate impact on stock or change the biomass of the stock, thereby lowering the overall risk? So when determining residual risk, the advisory committees considered the model projections, you saw these earlier, and recent catches. Next slide, please. And they asked the question as whether the data and information they had available, which was that projection information and also more recent catch and effort data, was enough to indicate that the stock will rebuild above the limit reference point in the desired period. The committees noted that given the significant measures implemented in the last few years since the stock assessment modelling was undertaken, that's increased the uncertainty in terms of the accuracy of those projections from that modelling, and therefore using them as a basis for adjusting residual risk. So while there were extensive adaptation measures that have been implemented in recent years and more coming, the committees took a precautionary approach and advised that there's insufficient data and information to assess the impact of these measures on total mortality for the stock at this time, as well as the future, what we can expect in terms of its future biomass trajectory. They did note that, you know, as time passes and more data is collected, then the effects of those measures should start showing up in some of our indicators over time, but it was just too early days. Next slide, thanks. And so the advice was to keep residual risk at extreme. And what does this mean in terms of the advice that was provided? Next slide, please. So under our framework, there's guidance at each level of risk as to what we expect next steps to be. For depleted stocks that are extreme risk, like jackass morwong, the framework provides guidance that we should implement management actions outlined in our harvest strategy before the next fishing season, and then over the following 12 months, develop additional adaptation measures to support long-term climate responsive and data-informed strategies for those stocks. So the advisory committees, they did acknowledge that a lot of work has already been undertaken in the last couple of years to support the recovery of jackass morwong. But to further that work, they supported the development of a rebuilding strategy for this species, which is a policy requirement. As part of that process, it was recommended that all available information be compiled on the climate drivers impacting jackass morwong, including any evidence of regime shifts. So there is a weight of literature behind our understanding of what is happening with jackass morwong. So bring it all together, and it will provide a more holistic picture to inform the development of that rebuilding strategy, including the formulation of reference periods, rebuilding timeframes, and also what subsequent management actions we need to take. It was also a priority for us to address the reasons for the increased state commercial catch in recent years, given its potential to undermine the effectiveness of the measures that we'd implemented offshore. And the advice highlighted the importance of reviewing the effectiveness of the measures that have already been implemented to date. We can't just say we've implemented this and set and forget. We do need to understand what it means for the stock going forward. Some of you who might have looked at the trial report before this, which is available on our website, will note the final risk for jackass morwong during the trial was high, whereas what I'm presenting today is extreme. And that's off the back of changes that we made to the framework around the residual risk process to make it more robust and quantitative and based on data and information. And so the committees have really taken a precautionary approach with this one of collect more information on this stock and start taking further actions. Next slide, please. So I'll go through a couple of things to consider very briefly, things that we learnt during the trial, but also when we're undertaking assessments. And then I'll briefly wrap up with how our rollout is going. So stakeholder engagement is a really key element and strength of the framework. We have learnt through the trial and also through implementation that stakeholders need to be engaged early and where possible, use existing forums to do that. And that provides for comprehensive input into assessments and the best informed outcomes from those assessments. This engagement was critical, for example, when we were developing the framework through one of the assessments for Patagonian toothfish, which is a stock down in our subantarctic fisheries. It was identified that there were some gaps in our assessments, and that was critically important. But it also spawned a discussion on how and where the additional information that had been identified should be incorporated into our assessments. And that really resulted in a change to our framework where if you have information that informs climate or stock status risks, then incorporate that at step one and reserve residual risk for evaluating the effect of adaptation measures that you've implemented. Next slide, thanks. When applying the framework in the initial stages, a key decision that will need to be made is to what species you should be assessing. The approach we have applied for in our FishMIP fisheries is to focus on species managed under harvest strategies, our target and key byproduct species, but also to make sure, also be mindful of taking a multi-species approach where we know there are technical interactions between species. Next slide, please. As it demonstrated in the Jackass Morn example, we need to be mindful of who else has responsibility for stocks out on the water and their management. So as I identified, you know, we've got quite a interesting jurisdictional arrangement with state and territory governments, and then my agency, which is a federal government agency, which have jurisdiction over different areas of waters. And as we all know, fish stocks don't respect lines on the water. And so one of the key considerations in the framework is to make sure that you're cooperating with your counterparts in managing shared or straddling stocks. Next slide, thanks. An issue that arose for AFMA fisheries in particular, and I'm sure it's going to emerge as issues across other jurisdictions, is how do you manage species whose biomass trajectory has primarily been driven by climate change, in particular depleted stocks, where recovery may not be possible or slower than expected or unpredictable. So we have a few stocks in this basket. Jackass Morwong is one of them, where it isn't easy to predict as to how it's going to respond to the measures that we've put in place, but also what are the impacts of future climate change going to be on that stock as well. There's currently limited guidance on this issue under Australia's commercial fisheries policy framework, and that's something we've been working with our counterparts in the Department of Agriculture, the policymakers, to try and address this issue and get more guidance on how we should be responding. So where you identify policy gaps, it's really important that you follow those up and see if you can plug those. Next slide, thanks. So to explain why there's some phones on the screens. So we didn't wait to make the first phone call until we had the latest version of the smartphone. And so we need to avoid the temptation to wait for information to either improve or be perfect before we take action. So we need to act promptly with the best available information we have while identifying what might be coming that will improve our understanding. So there was the you know, while we were running through the trial, there was the temptation to pause because we knew there was some studies that were going to be completed in a few years. But the decisions in looking at the precautionary approach and also ecologically sustainable development principles, you act on the best available information you have at the time. You can't wait for perfect information. So that was a key learning as well. Don't delay, just get a start on things. Next slide, thanks. I've already touched on how we account for uncertainty in the case study I ran through. and urge people to keep this at the forefront of their minds. There's always going to be a level of uncertainty in our climate projections and our stock assessments, and we need to identify where that uncertainty is at a level that needs to be accounted for in our assessments. Next slide, thanks. And also the question arose during the trial is how quickly should we be responding? Should we be pulling out all efforts to respond straight away? And there was extensive discussions that the impacts of climate change are not all happening now. They are happening, but they will unfold over the coming decades and in unpredicted ways as well. So it's not practical or feasible to implement every adaptation measure all at once, and implementation does take time. And so you also need to evaluate the effectiveness of measures you've already implemented before taking further steps. So the framework urges timely action while also accommodating staged and gradual approaches as well. Next slide. So the framework is also not set and forget. You just don't do the assessment once. You need to keep an eye on things. The climate is changing and it will do so, continue to do so. And so there are triggers built into the framework that where you have updated climate information that is significant, new stock assessments that might indicate different stock status information, maybe an extreme event like a marine heat wave has come through and really hammered your stock, or you've implemented a range of new adaptation measures and you've got some data and information on how they're going, that triggers you to take another look at your assessment and maybe update it. There's also a 5-year review period built into our framework. So 5 years from now, we'll be coming back to the framework, looking at how it's performing and updating it accordingly. Next slide, thanks. And this will be the last one for tonight. So in terms of how we're implementing it, we're going to be rolling it out over more than 80 target and byproduct species across all our fisheries around Australia. We've already completed 8 species assessments, one of which I provided a case study on tonight, and we're awaiting publication of those. And a further 31 have undergone initial consultation through our expert working group. So we're well on our way in terms of the framework implementation. It's performing as we're expected, based off all the extensive trial and development work that we went through. We'll be doing a staged approach because there are such a high number of stocks we'll be running over this framework, and we are doing our higher risk stocks first. And that was based on a preliminary step 1 assessment we undertook for all our stocks to really identify those we really need to focus on now, and then wrap up all the lower, those in the lower risk kind of range over the coming years. And because we go through quite an extensive stakeholder consultation process through our expert working groups, but also through 2 advisory committees we have for each fishery. One's a technical scientific body and the other one is a management advisory body. It takes time to make sure that these assessments are peer reviewed, they're technically robust, and any follow-up in the assessments in terms of questions or outstanding issues are followed up. And so that can take multiple rounds through those groups. And so we expect it to take approximately 3 years to roll out. So I'll tie it all up there. And next slide. If people want more information, it is all available on our website, afma.gov.au/climate change. And the framework I've talked about today is on that website, as well as a report on the trial outcomes and the key learnings, and also those range of other tools that I mentioned right at the start. And I'll hand it back to Grace and Claire. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was a wonderful presentation. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please put your questions in the Q&A box on your screen, and then we will go through them and ask Natalie. So I'll wait just a second, see if any questions come in. All right, we have one from Jay Peterson. He says, very interesting talk. Thank you. How feasible is it to use the framework on all managed species? Reassessment triggers could theoretically come pretty frequently.
Yes. That was a key consideration in looking at the scope of how many stocks we would apply this framework to initially. It's a really good question. Even with, the 80 stocks that we are looking at doing, look, most of those stocks are being reassessed every 3 years at least, if not more regularly, depending on their status. We're getting fairly regular updates in terms of our climate understanding as new studies have come out. And also the prevalence of extreme events is increasing. So we're getting more marine heat waves, for example, and we've had a pretty extensive harmful algal bloom that's affected a whole range of stocks off southern Australia. And so it is a element of the framework that we're going to have to see how resource intensive it's going to be. We will be doing that annual checklist, and there are some ways to make it quite simple. And if when you run step one, it is quite straightforward to work out whether your risk score is going to change or not as a result of new information. So it's a fairly quick process to do so. The part of the process that really does take the time is to go through all the consultation we've built into the process. So it's a bit of, we think it's manageable with the resourcing we've got, but it's a little bit wait and see. And I think it might be one of the tweaks down the track to the framework if we feel like it's really not working. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in the box, but we'll give it a couple more seconds to see if anyone's typing them. Aha, another one from Jay. He asks, who uses the climate and ecosystem status reports? Are they co-produced with users, getting feedback from them on what is and or isn't useful?
Yeah, thank you, Jay. That's a really excellent question. The climate and ecosystem status reports really came about. They're now in their 4th year, so they've been through a lot of development. And they really came about because we recognised that we needed to bring our key fishery stakeholders up to speed on what we understand is changing in our broader ecosystems when we're discussing our key fish stocks. So it's no longer enough to really focus on our discussions on just what's happening with a key stock. We do need to understand the broader environment that those stocks are living in and what the changes mean for those stocks, and to build stakeholder understanding that things are changing, but also to capture the knowledge that might be out in our stakeholder group in those reports to help support future monitoring. So those reports, they're developed by our CSIRO. We have about 12, a report for each of our main fisheries, so about 12 fisheries, and they go out to our 2 advisory committees for each fishery. So we call them our resource assessment group and our management advisory committees. One's that technical science group and the other one's the management advisory group. The reports are provided to those groups annually when they're having discussions about management settings, and in particular setting catch and effort limits for our fisheries, so that they're having the discussion around the broader context of what's happening in the marine environment when they're discussing management of our key fish stocks. A key part of those reports, and they're all available on our AFMA website, they're all public and they're uploaded straight after our advisory committees. A key part of that is to gather information from fishers themselves who sit on these groups as to what they're actually seeing out on the water. So I sit in an office, I don't see what's happening out on the water, but our fishers do. And so it's a really valuable way to collect information direct from those fishers, and it's recorded in the reports about they're seeing out on the water. And the hope is we start collecting those observations and we slowly build a weight of evidence to hopefully pinpoint some more specific indicators for our stocks. So, for example, if they're observing a certain change that's aligning with a certain environmental variable, then maybe we can monitor that in the future as a proxy for how our stocks might be responding. So I hope that answered that question. Yep.
Thank you, Natalie. We have about 4 minutes left, everyone, so there's definitely time for 1 or 2 more questions if you have them. Please put them in the Q&A box. So I'll wait another second to see if any pop up. All right, I'm not seeing any pop up. So with that, huge thank you to Natalie for presenting today. It was a wonderful talk, and it is being recorded, so it will be available on the FishSCORE website in a few days, so you can share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it. I know it was a funky hour for lots of people because we were trying to manage both US East Coast and Australian time, so thank you very much again to Natalie. She was presenting very late at night for her. And thanks for everyone for attending, and be on the lookout for our announcement for the next webinar in May.